Hey friends, tonight we're going back to a place most people only read about in textbooks. But we're not just reading, we're going to walk it. Breathe it. Feel the weight of it around us. You're about to spend one full day in the trenches of World War I. Not as a general, not as a hero in a storybook, but as one of the millions who woke up every morning wondering if they'd see the next. This wasn't just war. It was mud that pulled at your boots like hands. It was the stench of wet cloth, rotting wood, and something worse you stopped naming. It was a sky that didn't protect you, and a ground that offered no escape. So before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim your lights, let your thoughts soften, and if you haven't already, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Now breathe gently, and step with me into the quiet horror of a war that never slept. The mud that never let go. They called it mud, but that word doesn't do it justice. Mud is something a farmer walks through after rain, something that clings to your boots in spring and washes away with a good scrub. But this wasn't mud, not anymore. It was something darker, thicker, almost sentient, something that seemed to reach up from the very bones of the earth and decide who it would hold and who it might release. Your first step into it was enough to understand this mud was not passive. It didn't just sit quietly underfoot, it clutched at you, pulled at you. It wrapped around your boots like fingers and whispered into your legs, not so fast. By the second step, you realized it wasn't just your shoes sinking, it was your strength, your breath, your sense of self. The ground in the trenches wasn't ground at all, it was a soup of rot and rain, soaked through with human fear and forgotten names. Blood from battles months ago still floated in it somewhere, invisible, but felt, mixed with old rations, horse dung, lice, spilled oil, and the bile of 1,000 men who'd vomited from shell shock, bad stew, or worse. The smell alone was enough to give you nightmares, long before the nights truly began. Every movement took twice the effort. A 5-yard walk took 20 minutes, not because of distance, but because the earth fought you every inch of the way. Your boots would sink so deep you had to twist your foot sideways just to free it. But when you did, the suction made a sound, a deep, wet gulp, like the mud was disappointed to let you go, like it wanted to keep you, not just your boots, you, and it often did. There were stories, always whispered, never confirmed, of men who tripped into shell holes filled with water and never came back up, who slid off the duckboards in the dark and simply disappeared. Sometimes you'd see a helmet, just sitting there, half buried in sludge, no sign of the man it used to belong to. You'd think about calling out, but you never did, because what if he was still down there? What if he answered? You tried not to fall, but it wasn't always up to you. The walls of the trench sagged inward with every rainfall, melting like butter on a stove. The boards underfoot cracked and warped, or vanished altogether. In the wrong place at the wrong hour, even a careful step could become a trapdoor. One false move, and suddenly your legs sunk past the knee, and your boot won't come with you. You call for help, but softly, because shouting draws attention. So you grit your teeth and tug, and sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you climb out, other times you leave the boot behind, and you keep walking, half barefoot, through a world made entirely of wet decay. It wasn't just the physical strain. The mud got into your head, into your thoughts, into your sleep. You'd lie there at night, your back against a splintered plank wall, your knees drawn to your chest, because the floor was too cold and wet to stretch out, and you'd feel it, pressing into your spine, breathing against your calves. The earth, alive and slow, and watching. The nightmares weren't of shells or screams, they were of silence, sinking, being pulled down by something that never stopped pressing. There was never enough dry anything. Not socks, not blankets, not hope. If a letter from home came, it arrived soggy, ink running like tears. If your rations came wrapped in cloth, you could be sure the cloth was moldy. If your hands were warm, it meant a fever. If your feet went numb, it was already too late. You could hear the older soldiers muttering in their sleep about trench foot, about men who couldn't feel their toes and didn't notice until the flesh had turned grey and soft, like overcooked meat. You started to believe that the trench didn't want you to leave, that it kept you by wearing you down. Slowly, tenderly, not all at once. It didn't kill you with violence. It eroded you, a little skin here, a little warmth there, your will, your pride, your past, until you were just another body, hunched in the dark, indistinguishable from the mud that held you. Men started to stink in ways that had no name, not sweat, not rot, something in between. The officers said to stay clean, to change socks, to air your feet, to scrape your skin. but no one had dry socks, and the air itself was heavy with moisture, like the clouds had decided to live down here with us. You forgot what dry felt like, truly dry. A shirt that didn't cling, hair that didn't smell like sour water, skin that didn't flake from mold or pucker from being wet too long. It was all gone. The concept of dry became mythical. You dreamed of deserts, of cracked earth, of sun-warmed stone. You dreamed of sand, then woke to another day of brown water seeping into your underlayers, your pack, your hands. One man, the quiet one with the tooth gap and the locket, started laughing one night. It wasn't a joke, it was just a sound. Strange, sharp, endless. They asked him why, and he pointed to his boots. They grew roots, he said. I think I've been planted. No one laughed with him, but no one stopped him either. By morning, he was gone. You don't know where he went. The mud keeps secrets. Somewhere beneath your feet were letters that never got sent, shells that never exploded, teeth, bones, medals, shreds of uniform, lost voices, last breaths, entire thoughts that were never spoken aloud, swallowed before they could escape. You start to think of the trench as a giant stomach, digesting everything fed to it, including you. And still, the war carried on. The whistles blew, the shells fell, the orders came down the line. You were expected to climb out, to charge, to return, to dig again, to deepen the trench, to extend it, to build fire steps and drainage channels and shelters, more shovels, more boards, more sandbags, always more, and always, the mud beneath it all, seeping upward, laughing at your attempts to rise above it. Because in this war, there were two enemies, the ones across the field with their rifles and shells, and the one underfoot, quiet, patient, hungry, the one that never fired a shot, but claimed you all the same. And as the days passed, you stopped asking how long you'd be there, because the mud didn't keep time, it just kept pulling. How men vanished between shells. There's something you don't understand about war until it surrounds you. It isn't the noise. Not really. It's the space between the noise, the silence between the shells, that breathless gap between one boom and the next. That's where men disappeared. You see, artillery didn't come in constant thunder. It came in rhythms, not like a song, but like a living thing, breathing in and out. A shell would fall with a shriek, crack the sky open, then there'd be nothing. For 3 seconds, 10, a full minute, if the war felt generous. That pause, that terrible hollow pause, was all you had to live in, to shift, to think, to move, to pray. And in those moments, that's when the trenches swallowed people. You could be crouched in mud beside a man you've shared every miserable morning with. He just handed you a cigarette. You might have been laughing, quietly, the kind of laugh you don't know if you mean. You look away, you scratch your arm, you adjust your helmet, you blink, and when you look back, he's not there. Gone, not screaming, not thrashing, not even bleeding, just not. Maybe a part of his pack left behind, maybe the edge of a boot, or maybe not even that, and no one saw it happen. Sometimes it was the trench collapsing, a section gave way, just a foot of dirt, just enough to cover a man. Sometimes it was a shell that landed without sound, without light, just force, like the air itself punched a hole in the world. Sometimes it was madness, a man walking to take a piss behind the line, and never walking back. Or maybe he did, but not as himself. Messages would pass. He never made it, didn't come back. Check the crater by the latrine. Maybe he ducked out, maybe desertion, maybe vaporized. But after the first few months, no one wanted to ask. You stop asking when the answers are too many and too late. The trench was full of men who had names, until they didn't. And when one vanished, the war didn't stop to mark it. The others simply shifted down the line, filled the space, passed the matches down, and went back to counting the seconds until the next shell came. You didn't mourn, not out loud, because if you let yourself look too long at the empty space where someone had been, it might remind you just how easy it is for a man to stop existing without ceremony. Every time the guns paused, men leaned forward into that breath of false peace. Every time, a few never came back from it. War didn't just take men loudly, it also erased them quietly, and sometimes the worst part wasn't the shell that hit, it was the moment before it did, when a man still had the chance to vanish without a sound. The letter that arrived too late. There was something almost sacred about letters in the trenches, not because they were rare, although they were, and not because they brought news, because often they didn't. No, it was because letters were proof that a world still existed beyond the mud, beyond the barbed wire. beyond the unceasing cough of the guns. A world where someone thought of you, missed you, knew your name. They were folded paper reminders that you were still a person, not just a uniform, and that somehow you still mattered. Mail call was one of the few rituals that the war couldn't ruin completely. Even as the sky cracked open above, even as the rats grew bold enough to tug at the edges of your coat while you slept, even as your boots became extensions of your body from never being removed, a letter could stop time, just for a few moments. It would begin quietly. A corporal or clerk would walk the line with a bundle in his arms, his voice worn soft by the damp air and the weight of the names he carried. You'd hear a name, and a man would lift his head, another name, and someone would stumble forward, hope already cracking the frost from his expression. Each name was a candle, a signal that someone out there still remembered the man buried beneath the helmet. But sometimes, a name would be called, and no one would answer. The others wouldn't look, wouldn't speak. Maybe they didn't know what happened. Maybe they did, and they just didn't want to say it out loud. It was easier that way, because saying it meant facing the truth. The man the letter was meant for was already gone. Maybe it was just that morning, a shell, a sniper, a cough that never stopped. Maybe it was yesterday, during the charge, or last week, when they pulled what was left of him from a crater and whispered his name into the dirt. Either way, it was too late. The letter would still be in the pile, still sealed, still smelling faintly of wax, ink, and the world that no longer existed for him. A wife's handwriting, a child's drawing tucked inside, a note from a mother, promising to bake his favorite bread when the war was over. A small, soft piece of love and memory, folded perfectly and sent across hundreds of miles, only to arrive hours after the recipient had vanished from the earth, like smoke rising into fog. And what do you do with a letter like that? Some of the men tucked them into their own packs, promising silently to deliver them home, though most never would. Others slid them into the dead man's breast pocket before the burial, a quiet effort to make sure he didn't leave completely alone. There were those who read them, softly aloud to no one and everyone, their voices breaking on words like soon and safe and I miss you. Some letters were burned, others buried. A few were left behind on a shelf of sandbags, fluttering in the wind, their words dissolving in the rain until even the name at the top faded away. But the worst were the ones that came with news. The man had waited weeks to hear. Good news. A baby born. A brother returned from injury. A long-awaited permission to come home on leave. Words that might have changed something, had they arrived just a little earlier. A single day. A few hours. One less step toward that fatal corner. That unlucky shell. That last breath. It wasn't just the letter that arrived too late. It was hope. It was the life he could have had. The laugh he might have shared that night. The reply he would have written, carefully, in the corner of the trench, using his knee as a desk and a broken pencil he guarded like gold. And so the letters kept coming, and the men kept opening them, slowly, reverently, as though the paper might dissolve between their fingers if they weren't gentle enough. Because each letter was a thread, fragile, precious, and so easily snapped by time. In the end, war didn't just kill people. It ruined timing. It severed connections by a breath, a heartbeat, a misstep. And for every soldier who fell with no last word, there was a piece of home that arrived too late to save them. A letter, still warm from a mother's hand. A promise, never read. A name, called softly across the trench line, and never answered. Why the sky was never really quiet. There's a kind of silence you remember from childhood, the way the air feels before a summer storm, the hush that falls over a room when everyone listens to the same sound. But in the trenches, silence was never just silence. It was a lie, a warning, a shape that meant something was coming, because the sky above no man's land was never really quiet. At first you thought the silence between the shelling was a gift, a moment to breathe, to gather your thoughts, to pretend you weren't scared. But then you learned, that kind of quiet wasn't safety. It was suspense. It was the kind of stillness that made the hairs rise on the back of your neck. It meant someone, somewhere, was loading a gun, or lighting a fuse, or scribbling coordinates that would spell your name in fire. Even when nothing exploded, the sky had a sound. Distant engines, the whine of reconnaissance planes drifting like ghosts, the metallic buzzing of observation balloons anchored on far-off ropes. On cloudy nights, you could hear the dull thrum of something circling above the fog, invisible but present, an airborne reminder that you were never alone, not even under the stars. And when the bombs came, they didn't always scream. Sometimes they whistled. Sometimes they whispered. Sometimes they fell so fast you didn't even hear them until they landed, by which point, sound no longer mattered. You learned to read the wind. The way it changed just before the artillery began. The way the air would shift as gas shells were launched. Green mist drifting in on breezes that used to smell like hay and river water back home. Even nature didn't offer comfort. Birds had long since stopped singing. The few that stayed flew low and fast, nervous creatures that scattered before the crack of rifle fire. Rain no longer tapped gently on tin helmets. It hammered, it flooded, it turned the earth into a drowning place. Thunder sounded too much like shell bursts, and lightning was a cruel imitation of flash flares that lit up the night just before something horrible happened. And then, there were the nights that seemed too quiet. Those were the worst. Because silence was when you imagined things. When your thoughts grew louder than the war, when you heard your own breath and wondered if it would be your last. You'd sit there soaked through, covered in mud that smelled like rust and old blood, and wait for a noise that would break the silence. You almost wished for it, because silence made you feel like the world had stopped, and that somehow you'd been left behind in it. But the world hadn't stopped. The world was watching, listening, moving, and the sky, it was never really quiet. Because war echoed upward into the clouds, into the stars, into the places where men still dared to dream of peace. And sometimes, even after you left the trenches, even years later, you'd look up and swear you could still hear it. A faint hum, a distant boom, a sky that never forgot the war. The whistle that meant you had seconds left. There are few sounds in a soldier's memory more haunting than the sharp, shrill cry of the whistle. It didn't sing, it didn't drift like music, it didn't build like thunder in the distance. It came fast, it came high, and it carved through the fog of war with the precision of a blade. The whistle didn't mean get ready. It didn't mean think. It meant you had seconds, no more, no less, to climb out of the mud, over the top, and into a storm of steel. You could be half asleep, tucked into the shallow bend of a trench wall, your breath fogging in the morning air. You could be halfway through a sentence, or a letter to someone back home, or maybe just chewing the last bit of stale bread you'd saved from yesterday's rations. It didn't matter. Once the whistle blew, everything you were doing vanished beneath the roar of instinct. There was never just one whistle. The first would rip through the line, a signal from an officer, whose face you might barely know, whose hand trembled even as it raised the brass to his lips. That sound would be followed by dozens more, up and down the trench, like the call of birds that had forgotten how to sing anything but death. The sound carried across fields that were once farms and pastures, and now were nothing but wire and ruin. You had trained for this moment, practiced climbing ladders, knew how to keep your head low, your rifle close, your body moving forward, but no drill could prepare you for the moment your boot left the safety of the trench floor. Because that whistle didn't just signal a charge, it signaled a thinning of the world. The space between life and death collapsed to the width of a heartbeat. You could feel your own breath in your throat, like it was trying to claw its way out. Your hands shook, not from fear, but from the violent recognition that you could be gone in the next breath. That this, right now, was the edge of everything. Some men vaulted over the top without hesitation. Others froze for the briefest second, their eyes scanning the grey sky as if they might see the bullet that had their name written on it. A few didn't go at all, and the shame of that would follow them longer than any wound. But most obeyed, not because they were brave, not because they believed it would work, but because the whistle had become command, and command had become survival, at least for a moment longer. As you ran, the sounds changed. No more whistles. Now came the shouts, the crack of rifles, the scream of mortars, the dull thunk of boots slipping in mud as men stumbled and fell. You didn't look to the sides. You didn't check who had made it, or who hadn't. The sky might be raining shrapnel. The ground might be shaking, but your whole world had narrowed to what was in front of you, and the unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe, you could outrun the noise. Sometimes, there were men who'd hear that whistle, and never even make it over the lip of the trench. They'd be caught mid-motion by a shell, erased before their bodies had time to register the command. Others would run a few feet, feel a pressure in their chest, and collapse like marionettes with the strings cut. The lucky ones reached a shell hole, dove in, and waited for the next whistle to call them back, or not at all. The cruelest part. The whistle was used because it was simple. It cut through the chaos. It didn't require explanation, but its simplicity was also its finality. You didn't get to argue with it. You didn't get to ask for 5 more minutes to write that letter, or finish that smoke, or remember what your mother's voice sounded like. You got a breath, maybe two, and then you ran, and hoped the world didn't end before you reached the other side, because in the trenches of World War I, the whistle was not just a sound, it was a sentence, and every man knew, once it blew, you had seconds left to be anything but a shadow. A morning that always started in fear. There was something especially cruel about mornings in the trenches. You might imagine that daylight brought a kind of comfort, that the rising sun peeled back the darkness and gave soldiers a chance to breathe. But in truth, morning was worse. Morning didn't bring safety, it brought routine, and in the First World War, routine often meant death. You never really slept in the trenches. You drifted. You nodded off in the freezing mud, one eye open, your ears tuned not for birdsong but for the distant crack of rifle fire or the thunder of boots running where boots shouldn't be. You might have been wrapped in a damp blanket, or just curled into the curve of a trench wall, your body aching in places you didn't know had names. But when dawn came, when the sky turned from black to blue to ash, you felt it, that heaviness, that shift, that knowing, because morning always started in fear. Not fear of the unknown, not anymore. By then you knew exactly what the day could bring. You feared the known, the expected, the inevitable. You feared the sudden whistle that signaled a charge. You feared the popping sound of gas canisters being opened just before the wind changed. You feared the way an officer's eyes looked when they avoided meeting yours. You feared breakfast because it meant you were still alive and now had to do it all again. Every morning began with what they called Stand To, a practice carried out at dawn and dusk when every man had to be awake and ready with weapon in hand. It was military protocol, born from the fact that most attacks came during those low-light hours. So you stood, even if your feet were swollen, even if your back felt like it had broken overnight. You stood and watched the grey horizon and listened for movement, for the click of a safety being removed, for anything that might mean this was the morning you didn't see evening. The cold didn't help. It sank into your joints, into your lungs, into your soul. Some mornings your fingers were too numb to work the bolt on your rifle. Some mornings you felt like the frost was inside your chest, wrapping around your heart, squeezing it just enough to remind you that even breathing came with cost. And the fear was contagious. It drifted down the trench line like fog. One man's twitch became another man's panic. One false alarm, a shadow mistaken for movement, a branch mistaken for a barrel, could send a ripple of dread through dozens of soldiers. No one wanted to be the first to shout, but no one wanted to be the last to react, either. And then there were the sounds you couldn't name. A sudden thump, a distant grinding, like metal on stone. The strange silence that sometimes came right before the barrage. Those mornings were the worst, the ones where everything felt too calm, too still, because that stillness wasn't peace, it was the world holding its breath. Some mornings began with letters. Someone might pass you a mud-stained envelope from home, and for a brief second you remembered the sound of your mother's voice, or the way your brother laughed, or the smell of your kitchen back home when the fire was lit. But the warmth of those memories only made the cold harder to bear, because as the letter folded back into your pocket, reality returned. You were still here, still afraid, still waiting for something to begin or end. Even breakfast, when it came, wasn't a relief. Hard biscuits, cold tea, maybe a bit of meat if the supply lines had held. You ate without joy, you chewed without taste. The food wasn't fuel, it was ritual, a thing to do with your hands while you waited for the sky to fall again. And so, morning after morning, it continued. The sun would rise, the trench would stir, and every man would feel that familiar weight pressed down on his chest, the knowledge that today, like every day, might be the day his name was added to the ledger. In the trenches of World War I, morning didn't mean hope, it meant another chance to die, and the only thing louder than the fear in your heart was the silence of those who didn't wake up at all. The rats that slept beside you like friends. At first, you tried to ignore them. You told yourself they were just shadows, just movement at the edge of your vision. Nothing serious, nothing worth thinking about, but they didn't go away. They never did. The rats were as constant as the mud, as predictable as the fear. In time, they stopped being intruders. They became neighbors, uninvited roommates. Unwelcome, but undeniably present. And in the trenches of the First World War, sometimes the rats were the only living things that didn't want to kill you. They came in numbers too big to count. Hundreds, thousands, brown rats, Black rats, fat ones, lean ones, the kind that darted between your boots and the kind that stared at you with something that felt almost like recognition. They made nests in your packs. They chewed through your rations. They curled up near your body for warmth, and sometimes, horrifyingly, crawled across your chest while you slept. If you slept, they thrived in the same rot that destroyed everything else. They lived off corpses, not just the rats you saw, but the ones you didn't, the ones buried beneath the trench boards, or behind the sandbags, or half submerged in the walls of the dugout. Dead men didn't get buried deep. There was no time, and no room, and the rats knew. They always knew. You could hear them at night, not just 1 or 2 dozens, scratching, gnawing, fighting each other in the corners. Some men swore they heard the rats whispering, their tiny teeth chattering in some secret language of hunger. Others didn't bother to pretend anymore. They talked to the rats, shared rations with them, named them. You would too, eventually. When something follows you long enough, when it curls up beside you like a pet, the brain stops fighting. It just folds it in. You'd lay there, your back pressed to damp earth, your rifle cradled like a lifeline, and you'd feel the tickle of tiny feet on your blanket. Sometimes they crawled inside your tunic, seeking warmth. Sometimes they chewed your hair. More than once, a man would wake up screaming, not from a dream, but from a sharp bite on his ear, or cheek or nose. The rats were bold. They weren't afraid of you. Why should they be? They'd seen more death than you. They'd survived longer. In the trenches, rats didn't salute. They thrived. They ate everything. The food you tried to hoard, the letters from home you kept tucked in your coat, the boots off the feet of the dead. But worst of all, what they loved best was flesh, especially the soft kind. The eyes, the tongue, the belly. And in the nightmare of war, this wasn't a horror story. It was normal, common. You'd hear it whispered on night patrols, murmured over morning tea. They got to him before we could. And yet, somehow, their presence became part of the rhythm of life. When the shells weren't falling, and the snipers weren't watching, when your hands were too cold to write, and the silence became unbearable, the rats were there, always. A tiny skittering reminder that the world had changed in ways no one could take back. That filth and death had become ordinary. Some men set traps, others shot them for sport. But most of the time, you just let them be. You got used to it. You had to. In a place where men vanished overnight and hope evaporated by breakfast, the rats were constant. They didn't care if you were scared or sick or shaking. They came anyway, slept beside you, looked at you with those dark unblinking eyes, and the worst part, some nights, their company was the only thing that made you feel less alone. The boots that froze to the ground. They didn't tell you that your feet would betray you. That one morning, in the quiet before the shelling started again, you'd try to stand, and your boots simply wouldn't move. Not because of fear, though fear was always there like a second skin, but because sometime in the night, as the frost crept over the trench, as your breath turned to mist and your hands numbed into claws, the mud around you had hardened into iron, and your boots, waterlogged, cracked, barely stitched together by hope and threadbare laces, had frozen to the earth itself. You tried to shift your weight. Nothing. You pulled harder, gritting your teeth against the pain. Still nothing. It was as if the trench had decided it wanted you now, like it was tired of letting you borrow its walls and its floor and its silence. This time, it wanted more. It wanted your boots, your feet, maybe all of you. The others were already stirring. A cough down the line, the faint clatter of a canteen against a shovel. Somewhere, someone muttered a prayer, or maybe a curse. It was hard to tell anymore. You didn't call out. There was no point. You weren't in danger. Not yet. There was no gas in the air, no officer shouting orders, no whistle slicing through the dawn. Just you, and your boots, and the earth that refused to let you go. So you bent down, slowly, carefully. Your knees cracked from the cold, from the long weeks of crouching, of never standing straight, of never running. You wrapped your fingers around the laces, tried to loosen them, but the leather was stiff as bone. Ice crusted around the edges, tiny white needles where there should have been give. You couldn't feel your fingertips. You didn't know if that was from the cold or the fear. You pulled again, harder this time. And finally, you heard it. Not a crack, not a snap, but a soft, wet pop as the suction of frozen mud reluctantly released its grip. One boot, then the other. You staggered back like a man escaping a trap, your legs tingling with returning blood, your balance unsure, and that's when you noticed it. A pair of boots, still stuck, just a few feet away, half buried in the frost, surrounded by mud that hadn't been disturbed in days. You didn't need to ask whose they were. You already knew. You had passed them each morning, pretending not to look, pretending not to count how many days they'd been there. The man they belonged to had been taken, either by a shell, or disease, or something slower. The boots remained, frozen to the trench floor, like tombstones without names. That was the way of things. Men left, boots stayed. You wondered, as you walked away stiffly, your own soles still thick with frost, how long it would be before someone stepped over yours. Because in the trenches, even the ground remembered, and when the cold came, it took everything, your warmth, your strength, and sometimes your ability to leave. Some mornings, the war tried to kill you with shells, but other mornings, it only had to wait for the frost. What a body looked like after a week in the wire. You were told not to look. The sergeant said it plainly, without drama, like someone mentioning the weather. Don't stare too long at the ones in the wire. He didn't say it because it was dangerous, or because it would give away your position. He said it because looking too long changed something in you. It took pieces of your mind, and didn't give them back. But you looked anyway. Everyone did. Sooner or later, there was a body caught out there in the wire, about 20 yards past the trench. He'd been there for days, a week, maybe more. You weren't sure how long. Time moved differently at the front. It melted and stretched and shattered in ways that made calendars useless and clocks feel like liars. But the body didn't move. Not anymore. He must have been trying to charge, or escape, or maybe just find a spot in the dark to crawl away and die in silence. Maybe he got stuck. Maybe a shell tossed him there. The wire didn't care. It caught everything. Men, limbs, bits of uniforms, letters from home. And once it had you, it held on like it was built to strangle the future. You could see his arm still raised, caught on a strand, as if he were waving for help no one could give. The fingers had gone black. The skin, what was left of it, peeled back in places, like old fruit left too long in the sun. His coat had stiffened with blood and rain and rot, a kind of armor now, but not the useful kind. Rates had come and gone. Birds too, if they were brave enough. You could tell from the little nicks. The missing eye, the tangle of dark red, where his neck had once been clean, and the smell, even from here, you could taste it in your throat. It mingled with the smoke and the damp and the cold, and made every breath feel heavier than it should be. Some men tied cloths around their faces, others rubbed mud under their noses. You just tried to breathe through your mouth, and not think too hard about what the wire had done, because that was the thing no one said out loud. The wire didn't just hold bodies, it changed them. It turned men into warnings, into lessons, into things you weren't supposed to become. Every soldier who stared too long at a corpse hanging in the wire was really looking at his own reflection, a twisted glimpse of a future that might already be waiting for him out there, just a few yards away. At night, when the wind blew just right, the wire would hum, low, metallic, like it was singing to itself, and when that happened, some men swore they heard voices in it. Whispers, groans, names. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe it was memory, or maybe the dead really did talk when they couldn't be buried. In the morning, the body would still be there, still hanging, still waiting. You stopped looking after a while, not because it hurt less, but because it started to feel too normal. That was the worst part. The body in the wire became part of the landscape, like the mud, like the rats, like the war. And when a new recruit finally noticed it, wide-eyed, silent, mouth half open, you'd watch the way his face changed, the way his jaw stiffened, the way his hand shook just a little as he lit his cigarette. You wouldn't say anything, no one ever did. There was nothing left to say, because in the trenches of World War I, death didn't always fall with a bang. Sometimes it hung quietly in the wire, decaying in silence, reminding you every single day how close you really were to joining it. The sergeant who couldn't hear birds anymore. They said he was a good man, before the war, before the mud, and the wire, and the years that turned his boots into a second skin, and his voice into gravel. They said he used to whistle on morning patrols, used to point out birds to his daughter in the hedgerows, used to carry seed in his pocket, just in case a sparrow decided to trust him. They said all of this before, because after, there were no birds, not to him. He didn't lose his hearing, not the way you'd think. He could still hear the shells, the shouting, the distant groan of stretchers coming down the trench. He could hear the crack of boots on duckboards, the soft glug of someone sinking too deep into the muck. He heard everything, except birdsong. Not one chirp. Not one flutter of wings. Not even the lonesome call of a crow on the barbed wire at dusk. The others noticed it first. Young lads would duck at the sound of a lark overhead, twitch at the rustle in the brush. But the sergeant, nothing. Just stared ahead, eyes on the horizon, one hand always resting near his belt, like it needed to touch something solid, something that wasn't wings or wind or anything soft. There was a story passed around between trenches, like most stories were, that he once held a dying boy in his arms and tried to calm him by describing the sound of birds. The boy was bleeding from somewhere deep, lungs bubbling, breath short and panicked. The sergeant stroked his hair and whispered about robins and thrushes and spring mornings under clear skies. The boy smiled, they said, then died. After that, the birds left him. It didn't matter where he went, no matter how quiet the dawn, no matter how still the trees, he couldn't hear them. A kind of silence had taken root in his mind, selective, surgical. It filtered out anything too beautiful, too innocent, too alive. The war made sure of it. The trenches weren't built for song, they were built for survival. He didn't talk about it, he didn't complain, he simply carried on barking orders, cleaning his rifle, rationing tins, lighting his pipe with hands that trembled only after dark. He walked through fields where wrens had once nested, and saw only broken earth. He stood beside trees that once held nightingales, and smelled only cordite and rotting leaves. The new recruits asked why he always kept his back to the trees during morning watch. He didn't answer. Some nights, if you were close enough, you might see him stop mid-step and tilt his head, like he was trying to hear something just beyond the reach of human sound. Maybe a note, maybe a wing beat, maybe a memory, but then he'd shake it off and keep walking. Because in the world he now lived in, birds didn't exist, only orders, only duty, only silence where music used to be. When the war finally ended, the men were sent home with medals and wounds and scars stitched into their sleep. The sergeant went back to the village, back to the road lined with ash trees, back to the hedgerows and the soft-shouldered paths where finches still flitted from stone to stone. But even there, among everything he'd once known, the silence followed. His daughter placed a tiny dish of water on the windowsill one morning. A robin came, dipped its beak, shook its feathers, sang. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't hear a thing, and she, standing in the doorway, understood what the war had really taken. When you forgot what a dry shirt felt like. It started with a single drop. Maybe it was rain. Maybe it was your own sweat, running down the back of your neck. Or maybe it was the mud, soaked so deep into the weave of your tunic that it had become part of you. You don't remember when it began, not exactly. You just know that one day, maybe during a lull in the fighting, maybe while staring up at a sky so grey it felt like a ceiling, you realized you couldn't remember what dry felt like. Not just dry clothes, dry skin, dry breath, dry thoughts. Everything was wet. Your shirt, once a proper uniform, with its proud color and brass buttons, had long since given up. The color had turned into a shade of permanent filth, something between rust and sorrow. The fabric, stiff at the seams and loose at the shoulders, clung to your back like another layer of skin, only colder. It never warmed, not even by the fire, when you could sneak close enough for a few seconds without getting barked at for wasting heat. It wasn't just the rain, though there was plenty of it. The kind that didn't fall in drops, but in curtains, turning everything to soup. It was the fog, the sweat, the groundwater that seeped up from the bottom of the trench and rose into your boots, your trousers, your bones. It was the damp that crawled into your sleeves and refused to leave, that turned your socks into rags and your collar into sandpaper. You learned to live with it. Everyone did. At first you'd try to dry things, laying shirts over ammo boxes, tucking socks under your belt to catch the weak sunlight. But the rain always came back. The fog never left, and the trench didn't dry. It absorbed. It waited. One morning, you woke up and realized you hadn't taken your shirt off in 3 days, or maybe 5. You couldn't remember. The buttons had rusted. The sleeves were crusted with mud that flaked like old scabs when you moved. Your skin itched, but you didn't dare scratch too hard. Not after seeing what trench fever did to the others. You watched a man peel off his shirt and scream. Not from pain, but from the shock of air on his skin. His back was red and raw, like the fabric had been holding in every bad thing he'd seen. They burned that shirt, burned it right there in the mud, and he stood with his arms out, like he didn't know how to fold them anymore without the weight of cloth. The officers, when they showed up, were no better. Their shirts were dry, sometimes, you could tell. The way the fabric moved when they turned. The way they smelled faintly of soap, or mint, or anything other than mildew and wet iron. You hated them for it. Not out of anger, anger took energy, but out of memory, because their dry shirts reminded you of what you'd forgotten, the feel of clean linen, the whisper of cloth against skin, light and warm, and normal. Sometimes, late at night, you'd dream about dry clothes. Not the big things, coats or boots, but small ones, a handkerchief, a dry sleeve you could wipe your eyes with, a clean shirt folded neatly at the end of a bed that didn't reek of mold. You'd dream of slipping it over your head and feeling it settle across your shoulders like a blessing. You'd imagine your skin not recoiling from touch. You'd imagine not smelling like earth and blood. Then morning came, and your shirt was still wet, still heavy, still clinging. You didn't cry, not anymore. Tears were a kind of moisture you couldn't afford, so you carried on, shoulders hunched, arms crossed, not for warmth but out of habit, because once long ago crossing your arms meant something. It meant protection. It meant waiting. It meant you could still feel the edge of yourself under the damp. Now it just meant the shirt stuck a little less when you moved. And in the end, when the war passed through you and left you standing, barely, among the ruins of what once was, you finally found yourself with a moment of peace. A new uniform, crisp and folded, placed at the foot of your bunk in a wooden hut that didn't leak. The officer nodded once, then left you alone. You reached for it, touched the clean fabric, and froze. Because for a terrible moment, you didn't know what to do. Dry didn't feel real anymore. It felt like a memory someone else had told you. So you sat there, shirtless, cold, unmoving, and somewhere deep inside your mind, you waited for the rain to come back. Why the latrine became a sanctuary, in a place where comfort was rationed thinner than the soup, and privacy vanished. The moment your boots hit the trench floor, the strangest things became sacred. Not the officer's tent, not the makeshift chapel, not even the bunk where you tried, and failed, to rest. No, what became holy, in that upside-down world of wire and mud, was the latrine. The latrine. A pit in the ground. A wooden box with a hole. A structure that in any other life you wouldn't have glanced at twice. But here, in the endless damp roar of the war, it was something else entirely. It was, somehow, the only place a man could be alone. At first, no one would admit it. You'd trudge there with the same scowl everyone wore, trying to act like it was just another unpleasant task. But when the door creaked shut, if there was even a door, or when the tarpaulin flapped behind you just enough to block the view, something strange would happen. For a minute, you were alone with your thoughts. No shouting, no shells, no orders, just quiet. That kind of quiet was priceless. Men lingered, not long but longer than they needed to. No one talked about it, but everyone knew. You'd see boots waiting outside, scuffed and patient. No one rushed, not here. The latrine had become the closest thing the trenches had to a sacred space, a place where the noise of war dimmed, where even the rats gave you a moment's grace. Some scribbled on the walls, little messages, jokes, fragments of poems, drawings of places far from the Western Front. One soldier drew a perfect outline of the cathedral in Reims, before it burned. Another left behind a sketch of a woman holding a cup of tea. Underneath, it just said, "Almost home." And someone else carved a date into the wood, not of the war, but of their daughter's birthday. She'd be 5 now. It wasn't the smell that mattered, or the mud, or the fact that the structure leaned so precariously that a stiff breeze might send it down into the very hole it crowned. It was the pause, the break, the absurd comfort in knowing that, for 60 seconds you didn't have to be a soldier. Here, no one asked for a rifle report, no one shouted for backup, no one died. You could breathe. Sometimes you'd just sit and count the cracks in the wood, count the seconds between shell blasts, count the days you'd been wearing the same socks. Sometimes you'd just stare at the floor and remember what it was like to use a bathroom that flushed, with warm tiles and soap, and a mirror that didn't show a stranger's face. Looking back, there were rules, unspoken but followed like gospel. You didn't knock, you didn't shout. If a man was inside, you let him be, because everyone knew he might be saying a prayer, he might be reading a letter again for the 100th time, he might be trying to forget where he was. One man, quiet and young, used to sing inside, not loud, barely more than a hum, but it was a sound so soft, so unlike anything else in that brutal place, that the others stopped teasing him. They let him hum. They waited their turn, and when he didn't come back one day, someone else picked up the tune. The song stayed, even after the singer didn't. Sometimes when the trench grew too loud, when death felt too close, you'd glance at the latrine and feel that pull, that small, shameful longing for solitude, and you'd go, not because you needed to, but because you needed something, space, quiet, the illusion of safety. And that's why, in the middle of the war, in the middle of hell, men looked at a hole in the ground and saw a kind of sanctuary, because when you have nowhere else to be human, even a latrine will do. The cigarette shared right before the charge. You didn't smoke before the war. Not really. Maybe a puff at a wedding, a try-hard drag behind the stables with your cousins, laughter caught in your throat, lungs stinging, too proud to cough. But out here, out in the trenches, where the air itself felt scorched and spoiled, smoke became a kind of prayer. You didn't start the day with breakfast. Not most days. You started with mud and cold and the sound of a rat dragging something soft through the slush. But then came the cigarette. If someone had one to spare, if the rations had come through, if the quartermaster hadn't forgotten your section again, if the rain hadn't ruined every scrap of rolling paper in the sector, if, always if, it wasn't about the tobacco, not really, it was about the pause, the flicker of something steady, the tiny flame cupped by two hands, as if protecting the last candle in a world gone dark. You didn't light it so much as you brought it to life. You shielded it from the wind, like it mattered more than your own breath. Because in that moment, it did. But this one, this cigarette, was different. It was passed between you and a man you barely knew. He was from another unit, spoke with an accent you couldn't quite place. Maybe Welsh, maybe something deeper, older. You'd seen him around the trench. Boots always polished, letters folded into the breast pocket of his coat. He carried himself like someone who still remembered what dignity felt like. And somehow, he always had cigarettes. The night before the charge, everything was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't last. The kind that feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. Waiting. You were waiting too. You had your rifle, your bayonet, your orders. None of it made the waiting easier. That's when he offered it. No words. Just the gesture. A hand holding out the last cigarette in the pack. You didn't hesitate. You took it. Matches were precious, so he lit it for you. He cupped the flame, struck it once, twice. The third time it caught. You both leaned in, the glow reflecting in his eyes. Gold and hollow, you inhaled. The smoke didn't taste like anything good. It tasted like damp paper and cheap leaf, like fire and tin, like the underside of heaven. You held it in your lungs longer than you should have, as if that breath could somehow anchor you to the moment. He took it back. No words. Just a nod. You passed it, one to the other, back and forth, not counting the puffs. That wasn't the point. There was no time for rules. You were sharing something ancient, something almost sacred, a reminder that you were alive now, even if you wouldn't be in an hour. Somewhere down the line, someone whispered a joke. Laughter, tight and too high-pitched. Nervous, the kind of laugh that sounded more like a gasp. Another man crossed himself, another kissed a photo, the edges soft and folded like the pages of a prayer book. But you just smoked. That last cigarette moved between your fingers like it had always been meant for this moment, as if every leaf inside it had grown for this one shared breath, this pause between what was and what was coming. The whistle blew. It wasn't loud, but it was final. You didn't remember who took the last drag. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was you. You didn't look. You dropped it, maybe. Or maybe you crushed it against the wall of the trench, twisting it down into the mud, like it was something that needed to be buried too. Then you climbed the ladder. You ran. And the world turned into light and dirt and metal, and screaming. Later, much later, after the charge, after the noise, after the men who screamed, and the men who didn't, you sat in the aftermath. Helmet askew, face covered in ash, and someone else's blood. Your fingers reached into your pocket, and you found it. Not a cigarette, just the matchbook, soggy, torn, and empty. A rain that fell like nails on tin. You thought you knew rain. You'd walked through it on cobbled village streets, felt it dance on the roof of the old schoolhouse, watched it blur the edges of trees in spring. You'd cursed it during harvest, praised it during drought, and once fell asleep to it tapping softly against the window beside your childhood bed. But that kind of rain belonged to another life. Out here, out on the front. It wasn't rain. It was something else, something meaner. It didn't fall. It attacked. It came down with the weight of fury, not water. sharp and endless, like 1,000 rusted nails hurled from the sky, clattering on sheet metal, biting into every surface, canvas, helmet, skin. It had sound, not the soft hiss of rain in a meadow, but a rattle like distant machine guns, stuttering across the heavens. A sound that made you flinch even before you were awake, and when you woke to it in the dark, half buried in a trench full of freezing muck, you couldn't always tell if it was rain or fire, because sometimes it was both. The sky never warned you. There were no gentle grey clouds, no scent of petrichor, just darkness, and then it began. First a spatter, then a sheet, then a hammering that made the ground vibrate like the war was rising from underneath. Water didn't trickle here, it invaded. It crept down your collar, filled your boots, turned your pack into dead weight. It soaked your letters, blurred your name on your tags. It didn't wash anything clean, it just made the filth cling tighter. And when it hit the tin helmets, it was unbearable. The sound was too close, too sharp. You'd hear it on 100 heads, like the trench had become a percussion section for some godless orchestra. Tink, tink, clang, then silence, then more. It echoed inside your skull until you forgot where the war ended and the rain began. The older men in the trench told stories of snow, of blizzards in 15, of frostbite and how you could snap off a man's toe like a biscuit. But snow was quiet, noble, even. Rain was cruel. It didn't just soak, it hunted. It filled the shell holes with black water. It made every climb slippery, every grip fail. You could die from it, not just from drowning or pneumonia, but from the simple mistake of slipping when you needed to run, of falling when the whistle blew. And in the night, when it was just you and the rain, and the occasional moan drifting from no man's land, it felt like the world was being erased, one drop at a time. Sometimes it rained for days. The trench would flood, water up to your knees or thighs, or worse. You'd sleep standing up, pressed against the walls, eyes open, listening to it drip from your rifle, from your chin, from the wooden beams that were slowly giving way. The smell would rise, mud, sweat, rot, oil, something else. You couldn't name it, but it clung to you. In those moments, you understood why men talked to themselves, why some of them stared at nothing, why a few walked into the rain and didn't come back. One night, it started with thunder, low and far away, a groan from the sky itself. Then the drops began, slow and heavy, like a warning. You and the man next to you pulled the tarp tighter over your heads, even though it didn't help. His hands were shaking, not from fear, just from cold, from exhaustion, from the fact that he hadn't been dry since April. The rain picked up, and then it turned. It came sideways. It pelted your face so hard, it felt like gravel. You turned your head, but it found the angle. It always found the angle. Your helmet rang with it. Your coat stuck to you like a second skin of ice. The man next to you muttered something, not words, just sounds, prayers maybe, curses. You couldn't tell. A few hours later, you found him dead. Not from a bullet, not from shrapnel, just gone, as if the rain had finished what the war started. You buried him, the next morning, just above the waterline, marked it with his spoon, and then it rained again. A sound that told you a gas shell was coming. There were many sounds in the trenches, most of them terrible. The long, tearing rip of artillery, the cough of rifles that never stopped, the metallic growl of boots in mud, of bayonets against stone. But there was one sound that turned your bones to ice before your mind had time to understand. It wasn't loud at first. Not always. Sometimes it was just a whistle, shrill and curling, like wind pressed through a keyhole. Other times, it began with a thud, deep and distant, like the footstep of something impossibly large. You might think it was just another shell, and most of the time, it was, but not always. You'd learn to hear the difference, not with your ears, but in your spine. A certain hollow quality, a rattle inside the whistle, the way it ended with a hiss instead of a bang, and when it landed, when the shell didn't explode with fire but cracked open with a dry pop, you knew, gas. You didn't have time to think. No one did. Every second mattered, every half second. You could be mid-sentence, mid-step, half asleep, and suddenly someone was shouting gas, 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 a scream so loud and sharp it could break your skull open. Not because of the volume, but because of what it meant. You'd drop everything. You could be writing a letter, spoon halfway to your mouth, fixing your boot, none of it mattered. Your hands moved on instinct. grabbing the rubber mask hanging around your neck or tucked into your pouch. Sometimes it was stuck. Sometimes you fumbled. The straps caught in your helmet. Your fingers slipped. Your breath already felt poisoned. If you were fast lucky, you got the mask on before the green or yellow mist rolled through the trench like spilled light. If you weren't, well, gas didn't scream like bullets. It whispered. It crept. You didn't always see it at first, not until it curled around your knees like a cat made of poison. It stung your skin, even through your clothes. It clung to the ground, refusing to rise, gathering in shell holes and low spots like it had a map of where the weakest men were hiding. The sound of a gas shell coming wasn't just a warning, it was a sentence, and worse than hearing it was hearing it too late. Some soldiers didn't trust the masks. Some had masks so old or damaged that putting them on was a cruel formality. They'd wear them anyway, because hope was a powerful liar. You could always tell who had been caught without one. The way they wheezed for hours, clawing at their throat. The way their skin turned raw and blistered, like fire that didn't burn clean. Their eyes, God, their eyes, swollen shut, pouring tears long after the gas had gone. The trench would fall silent then. No jokes, no songs, just coughing. Just the sound of lungs refusing to forgive, and if you lived through it, you never walked without listening again. You trained yourself to hear that sound, even in your sleep, especially in your sleep. The way it sliced through dreams and woke you up cold. Gas came with weather, too. You learned that fast. It moved slower in cold, stayed low in the rain. On a still day it could hang in the trench for hours, invisible, waiting. Sometimes you'd send rats or birds ahead. If they dropped, you knew the path was still deadly, and the fear didn't end when the gas left. The masks, thick, rubbery things with glass eyes, became your second skin. You'd wear them too long. Sweat pooled inside them. Your breath fogged up the lenses until you couldn't see the man next to you. You'd speak, and your voice sounded distant. Someone else, underwater. And you'd wonder if you were still in your body, or already on the way out. Even when you weren't under threat, you imagined the sound. A creak in the distance, a bird flying low, a strange echo off a nearby trench wall. Your heart would seize, and your hands would move to the mask before your brain caught up. You lived in readiness, you slept in fear, and when the shell did come, and you heard that specific sound again, that slithering pitch, like a snake hissing through iron, it was like the world stopped breathing. Everyone froze, then everyone moved. Because there were no second chances, not with gas, not with that sound. The mask you had to find in 10 seconds or die. You kept it close, closer than your rifle, closer than your letters from home, closer than the good luck charm tucked into your breast pocket, the ribbon, the coin, the scrap of someone's handwriting, closer even than your thoughts. Because out here, in this never dry trench, with mud up to your ankles and frost biting at your bones, your gas mask wasn't just equipment, it was the line between being a man and being a memory. There were rules, of course, orders barked during training. 10 seconds, that was the number. You had 10 seconds from the moment someone shouted gaze to get that mask on your face, not 12, not even 11, 10, any longer, and your lungs might already belong to the war. So you rehearsed it, over and over. You practiced it blindfolded, in the dark, in the rain, in the stink. You could be half asleep, halfway through a tin of cold beans, or mid-letter to your mother, and when that cursed word echoed down the line, your body moved faster than thought. Your fingers flew to the satchel at your chest or belt, yanked it open, pulled out the thick, rubbery thing, and slammed it over your face. Straps tight, seal good, breathe shallow, pray, 10 seconds, and sometimes, you didn't make it. Sometimes you were dreaming, or laughing, or writing. Sometimes the mask was under your coat, sometimes it had frozen stiff. Once you saw a man drop his in the muck, and fumble for it, like a blind man reaching for a candle in a burning house. His hands shook. He begged someone to help. No one moved. No one could afford to. You watched him die in slow motion, coughing up strings of blood and froth, his eyes wide with terror, looking not at the gas, but at all of you, alive, still breathing. You never forgot his face. After that, your mask never left your side. You tied it to your wrist with twine. You slept with it under your arm. You cleaned it, oiled it, whispered to it, like it was a living thing. Because it was, in a way. The mask didn't just save your life. It became your life. It shaped your days, your dreams, your nightmares. You saw it in your sleep. You felt it, even when it wasn't there. Straps digging into the back of your skull, rubber pulling at your skin, the reek of charcoal filters clogging your nose, The sound of your own breath, trapped, mechanical, became the only rhythm you trusted. You learned to recognize the wheeze of a faulty valve, the click of a cracked lens. You watched other men fail to notice and disappear from the trench by morning. Sometimes when it rained hard and the trench flooded, you wondered what would kill you first, drowning or breathing in death. You started wearing the mask for drills, even when no gas had been seen for days. It wasn't superstition, it was survival, because the enemy didn't always send a warning. Gas drifted in silence, it sank, it waited, it found the weak, the tired, the careless, it found the ones who didn't rehearse, and the moment you forgot the rule, that one simple, brutal truth, you'd find yourself with seconds to live, and no time to fix the mistake. You told yourself you'd be ready, always, and when the wind shifted, when someone at the far end of the trench screamed the word, "Gaze," your hands moved like fire, your body knew before your brain did. You clawed at the satchel, ripped the mask free, pulled it tight, no thinking, no talking, no second chances, because it wasn't just about living, it was about not dying in that way, not coughing out your soul, not clawing at your throat like a man buried alive, not adding your screams to the already godless night, just 10 seconds, that's all you ever had, and every second after that was borrowed time. How you slept surrounded by the dead. There were nights you didn't want to sleep, not because of the noise, though there was always noise, the dull, distant thud of shells, the soft patter of rats, the wind that whispered in the slats of rotting wood. No, you stayed awake because of what was next to you, because of what or who might already be lying there, unmoving, inches away, and cold. There wasn't room in the trenches. Not really, not for all the living, and certainly not for the dead. So when someone died, and no one had time or daylight, or a break in the shelling to move the body, you slept next to them. Sometimes you knew them. That was the worst part. You'd fall asleep with someone snoring at your side, both of you wrapped in damp coats under an oilcloth tarp that didn't stop the cold, and wake up with them stiff, eyes open, lips blue. You'd feel their body against yours, and realize it wasn't the warmth you felt earlier, it was the absence of it. The weight of a life that had stopped sometime during the night, silently, without ceremony, and you'd stay there, because where else could you go? The trench was a grave you lived inside of, and most nights it felt like it knew that. Sometimes you didn't ask, you just climbed into a dugout, into the mud and straw, and took the only spot that hadn't already been claimed. You didn't ask whose boots those were, sticking out from beneath the tarp in the corner. You didn't lift the edge of the coat bundled near your feet to see if anyone was breathing beneath it. You just lay there, eyes open, listening, and hoping you weren't sleeping next to a corpse. Other times, it wasn't just one, it could be 4, 5, more. After a bad bombardment, there weren't enough hands or stretchers to carry them out. The dead were lined against the trench wall like sacks of grain. They slumped over crates. They lay where they fell, their faces drawn, some still with cigarettes clenched between their teeth, some with their eyes closed, mercifully, some not, and still you had to sleep. You had to curl up beside them, and try not to breathe too deeply, not because of disease, though that too, but because of the smell. Death had its own air, heavy, sour, wet in a way the rain wasn't. You got used to it. That's what scared you the most. The first time you wept, the second time, you prayed, the third, you whispered their name and closed their eyes. By the 10th time you turned your back and slept, because your body couldn't keep going if you didn't. Because sleep was the one escape, the war couldn't deny you, and so you trained yourself to ignore the cold shape beside you, the way their boots stuck out, the way their hand outstretched, touched your coat. You told yourself it was a tree root, a sandbag, a trick of the dark. You shut your eyes and followed the rhythm of your own breath, one in, one out. They weren't breathing anymore, but you were. For now, and in the trench, that was the only difference between you and them. Why you learned to eat without looking down. There was a point when food became something more than food, when a spoonful of cold beans meant more than calories or comfort. It meant the world hadn't ended yet. It meant your hands still worked, your jaw could still chew, your stomach could still remind you that you were, against all odds, still alive. But eating in the trenches wasn't like eating anywhere else. There were no dining halls, no tables, no real fire to warm your meal, no chairs except for overturned ammunition crates or your own boots, no plates unless you brought your own mess tin, and even then it was usually dented, blackened, and coated with a thin film of grease from last week's ration. You were lucky if it had been washed. Luckier still if the water used to rinse it hadn't been scooped from the same mud you slept in. But more than the mud, more than the cold, more than the slop they called stew, what made trench meals truly unforgettable was what happened when you looked down. You didn't, after a while, not because you didn't care, but because caring meant seeing, and seeing meant facing the truth of where you were eating. Sometimes it was a rat, big as a kitten, bold as a thief, darting over your boot or squeezing between crates. You'd feel it brush your ankle, and keep eating. You wouldn't flinch. If it got too close, maybe you'd nudge it gently with your toe, not hard enough to kill it. Rats were everywhere. Killing one was like trying to empty the sea with a thimble. And besides, if you killed it, another would come, hungrier, meaner, so you didn't look, you didn't acknowledge it. You learned to chew with your eyes at eye level, never lower. Other times, it wasn't a rat. Sometimes, it was blood, old dry, sometimes, new, or a hand, half buried in mud, pale as wax, reaching from the trench wall like it had simply paused mid-motion, and never moved again. You might recognize the ring, the cuff, the shape of the nail, you might not. Sometimes, it was a face, mouth open, eyes closed, covered gently in a tarp that had slipped loose in the wind. You'd sit there, a spoon halfway to your lips, the wind lifting the edge of the tarp like a curtain, revealing someone who hadn't made it to breakfast, and still you would eat, because hunger didn't wait, because the dead didn't complain, because the last thing he'd want is for you to starve too. You'd take your spoon, gently stir whatever mash or paste they'd dropped in your tin, and look forward, not down. You didn't look at your hands, either. They were always filthy, caked in grime, blackened at the nails, smeared with grease, or soot, or worse. If you looked, you might see what you'd touched earlier. The wounded, the ropes from the stretcher, the broken boot heel of a man you dragged back in the night. You might see a fly land on the meat in your tin, buzz a few times, then take off again, and you'd still eat, because there was no choice, because this was lunch, because sometimes food was the only reminder that your body still had needs, that it still wanted to survive, even if your mind hadn't made up its mind yet. You learned to eat fast, too, because shells didn't pause for tea breaks, because the enemy didn't care if your stew was hot, or if your biscuit had already gone soft from the fog. You'd take a bite, listen, take another, wait. Every sound from above could be thunder or death. You learned to chew with one ear on the sky, and sometimes the smell of your food was interrupted by another smell, something that lived in the mud, in the trench walls, in the very air. That sour, awful stench that made your stomach clench and your throat tighten, the smell of what war left behind, but you couldn't let it stop you. You'd chew through it, swallow through it. You'd take another bite and look at the sky, or the end of your rifle, or the back of the man ahead of you, anywhere but down, because the truth was, down there just beneath your boots was the worst of it. The blood, the memories, the bone-white fragments of someone who hadn't been carried out in time, the buttons, the belt, the crushed tin cup still in a dead man's hand. So you stopped looking. You looked forward, always forward, not out of denial, but necessity, because down there was everything the trench took, and here, in your hands, greasy, trembling, stubborn, was everything you still had. A cold biscuit, a spoonful of meat paste, and one more moment you were still breathing. The trench that collapsed at midnight. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a sound that wasn't a sound, just a shift, a groan in the earth, a kind of sigh, like the land had finally grown tired of holding up the weight of all this misery, and decided to give in. At first, no one noticed. A few sandbags slumped, a board creaked somewhere behind the dugout, and someone muttered about the rain. It had rained for days. The kind of rain that seeps into the bone, not just the skin, that turns every wall into sponge, every footstep into suction. The kind of rain that doesn't stop but settles, slowly, silently into the trench walls, into the roof beams, into the wooden supports, holding back the 100 tons of soaked earth above your head. By midnight, the water had already taken its toll. The walls bowed slightly. One of the posts at the corner of the dugout had started to lean, just enough to make the lantern on the nail beside it swing gently back and forth, like a pendulum, counting down something you couldn't name yet. But you noticed. You always noticed. In the trenches you became fluent in small changes. A shift in the mud. a smell that wasn't there before. The way the silence settled too evenly, too completely. That was when it gave, not all at once. Just a soft, sudden shoo, like someone tearing a blanket in slow motion, followed by the deep, wet collapse of timber and soil, and everything behind it. And then screaming. You scrambled to your feet, your boots sticking in the mud that now rose like a tide, pulling everything with it. You couldn't see past the cloud of dirt and dust that exploded outward when the trench wall gave way, and for a second, only a second, you thought maybe it was a shell. Maybe this was just another bombardment, maybe you should throw yourself down, maybe, but then you heard the voice. It was Thomas. You recognized the cough, the panic, the way he said your name like it was a rope he could climb out with. He had been on watch at the bend, sitting just beneath the ridge that collapsed, you remembered now. He had joked, earlier that day, about how the post above his head had started to groan when he leaned on it. No one had laughed. You didn't even grab your rifle. Just the lantern. You waded forward, through waist-high sludge, into the wall of smoke and dirt and limbs. The trench wasn't there anymore. Just a slope of earth, wet, broken, steaming in the cold. And somewhere inside it, Thomas. You dug with your hands first, then with a mess tin. Then someone handed you a shovel, and it felt like trying to move the sea with a spoon. You found a boot, still tied, still warm, but no leg inside it. The air was choking now. Men were shouting, but they didn't know what to do. The other end of the trench was unstable. Another collapse would take the rest of them. Someone screamed to get back. Another said to keep digging, and then just faintly, you heard him again. Not a full word, just a sound, a breath that wasn't yours. You dug faster, a sleeve, a shoulder, a face, half covered in mud, mouth open, eyes wide with disbelief. He wasn't dead. Not yet. You and two others pulled him out like pulling a memory from a dream. His arm was twisted wrong, his leg bleeding from somewhere you couldn't see. He didn't scream, just held onto you like you were the last thing holding him in this world. Behind you the trench shuddered again. This time you didn't stay. You carried him, 3 of you now, over the lip of what had once been your post, slipping and swearing and soaked to the bone. The wall collapsed again behind you. The entire section swallowed whole, gone. Your bedroll, your pack, your last photo of home, gone. Thomas coughed, and the blood on his lips looked darker than the night, but he was alive, and somehow, so were you. The trench kept secrets, kept the things it swallowed, helmets, boots, names, whole stories, pressed flat beneath the weight of a world at war. But that night, at midnight, in the rain, it let one man go, and you never looked at mud the same way again. The one spoon you never let go of? There were soldiers who carried Lucky Charms, worn coins from home. A letter folded so many times the ink had bled into the creases. A girl's ribbon tucked under a collar, a bit of string, a shell casing. Things that didn't make sense to anyone but them. But for you, it was a spoon, not a fine spoon, not silver or engraved, just a dull, dented piece of army-issue tin that had been with you since your first day in uniform. You didn't know why it mattered, only that it did. Maybe because it was yours, maybe because it didn't break. Or maybe because, in a world where everything could be taken, this was the one thing that stayed. You kept it in your boot, tied with a bit of string around your ankle. You could feel the edge of it shift slightly, with every step you took, like it was reminding you it was still there, still real, still ready to feed you the next cold mess of beans or barley stew, or whatever passed for a meal when the rations arrived late and half frozen. The first time someone asked why you still used that beat-up spoon instead of grabbing a new one from the supply, you just shrugged. But the truth was, you couldn't imagine eating without it. That spoon had been with you in every trench, through every shelling, every relocation, every loss. It had scraped clean the bottom of ration tins when you hadn't eaten in 2 days. It had stirred tea brewed from boiled trench water and a packet of sugar swiped from an officer's satchel. It had dug into frozen ground when your fingers went numb, trying to find a dropped bullet casing or an old coin someone said was lucky. You even used it once to pry open a crate when the screwdriver went missing. It was just a spoon, but it wasn't. One morning, you woke up to the sound of distant shelling, distant enough not to panic, close enough not to ignore. You checked your pockets, your pack, and when your hand didn't find the familiar curve of metal in your boot, your stomach dropped. You'd taken it off the night before to clean your socks, laid it gently on a flat rock outside the dugout, and forgotten. The panic wasn't logical. but it was real. You crawled out into the dim morning fog, boots slipping in muck, and felt around blindly near the edge of the trench. There, half buried, muddy, but intact. You cleaned it off with your sleeve, and held it for a second, longer than you meant to, before tucking it back into place like a ritual. Later that day, when a shell hit closer than it should have, and sent shrapnel into the back wall, you dove to the ground with your arms over your head, heart pounding. When it passed, you reached instinctively to your ankle. Still there. That spoon had fed you when you were too tired to speak, when your hands shook, when your breath came in shallow, smoky gasps after running through wire and over churned earth. It had clinked against the rim of tin mugs in dozens of silent toasts. Good luck, good night, goodbye. You'd seen others drop things, lose their keepsakes to the mud, to fire, to time, but you held on. Not because you thought the spoon was magic, not because you were superstitious, but because it reminded you that you were still here, still hungry, still human, still capable of lifting your hand and bringing something warm to your mouth, no matter what the world was doing outside the trench. Somewhere, you told yourself, someday, if you made it home, you'd hang it up, nail it to the wall next to your medals, if they gave you any. And if they didn't, maybe just by itself. A quiet little proof that you were once there, that you had survived a place where men disappeared and memories sank into mud. It was just a spoon, but it was also your story, and that was something you never let go of. When a shovel was worth more than a rifle, you didn't expect it to matter. The rifle was always front and center, polished, slung, cleaned, counted. The rifle was what they told you to trust, to sleep beside, to live by. It made you a soldier. It gave you purpose, rank, something to grip when the fear came fast. But in the trench, that rifle did almost nothing for you. Not when the sky opened up and rained metal, not when the walls collapsed in the middle of the night, not when your friend was buried chest deep in mud, still breathing, and the seconds were ticking down. In those moments, it was the shovel that saved lives. It was heavier than it looked, not elegant, not sleek, not a weapon you trained with in parade drills or posed with in photographs. Just a blunt-edged piece of iron, scratched and worn, its handle dark, with years of sweat and blood. But you learned quickly that in the trenches, it was the one thing between you and the earth that wanted to eat you. There was no glory in digging, no medals for clearing drainage, no ceremonies for shifting waterlogged clay so a man could sleep 1 inch above drowning. But every inch mattered. Every wall of sandbags stood because someone stayed up in the dark, hammering and packing and bracing it with a shovel while the wind moaned, and something bigger rumbled behind the clouds. You remember the first time the line caved in. It was early, barely a week after you'd arrived. A mortar landed too close. No one knew who'd been hit. You and 2 others threw your rifles aside and clawed at the mud with whatever you had, hands, helmets, canteens. But it was the man with the shovel who moved the most earth. He found the soldier. He pulled him out. The boy didn't survive the night, but he got one more night. That mattered. From then on you kept your shovel close, tied to your kit, strapped to your back. You sharpened the edge, not for combat, though it came to that once, but for speed. You practiced with it the way others practiced with rifles. You learned how to wedge it between timber beams, how to hook sandbags back up when the wind tore them down, how to carve a trench shelf in minutes flat when the rain threatened to bury your feet again. And when the shelling came, you didn't reach for your rifle first. You reached for the shovel, to dig deeper, to build faster, to drag a man from the dirt before it settled over his mouth. You remember one winter night, bitter, endless, moonless. A shell had landed near the cookhouse. Smoke and screams. You couldn't even tell what part of the trench was hit, but you didn't need to. You just ran. You found the edge of the collapse, boards broken, food tins scattered, someone moaning under the timber. You dropped your gear, slid onto your knees, and started to dig. The rifle on your back clanged against the boards. You took it off, shoved it aside, and kept going. And you got him out, burned, bloodied, alive. That night, you leaned the rifle against the wall and left it there, but you cleaned the shovel, carefully, like it was something sacred. Because in that war, sometimes it was. The shovel didn't care if you were a private or a captain. It didn't jam. It didn't misfire. It never ran out of bullets. It wasn't designed to take a life. It was meant to uncover one, save one, carry one. And in the trenches, where death pressed close and loud and constant, that made all the difference. So when they asked what weapon you trusted most, you didn't say your rifle. You said the one thing that had kept the earth from closing in, a shovel. The moment you realized the ground was breathing, it didn't come all at once. The realization crept in slow, like everything in the trenches did. The way sleep found you in pieces, or how hunger never fully left. You didn't say it out loud. Not at first, but you began to notice. You began to feel it. The ground was alive, not in the romantic way they taught you in school. Not fields of wheat swaying in golden arcs, or moss-covered hills resting beneath an open sky. No, this ground pulsed, shifted, exhaled. It wasn't just earth anymore. It was memory and pressure and something deeper than either. The first time it happened, you were crouched in the firestep at dawn. Not much light. The horizon was only a vague smear beyond the barbed wire. You had your back against the wall, your chin tucked to your chest, and for a second, just one, you felt it under your boots. A kind of low tremble. Not a shell, not thunder. It was too slow, too patient, like something turning over in its sleep. You stood quickly, looked around. No one else noticed. A rat skittered over your bootlace, indifferent, but the feeling lingered. Later, as the rains returned and turned everything to sludge again, you realized it was always there, under you, around you. The mud wasn't just waterlogged dirt, it clung with intent. It swallowed socks, boots, even entire rifles, if left untended. There were places along the trench wall where your shovel would strike something not rock and not quite bone, and the entire trench would go silent for a beat. That silence, that was the moment. The moment the ground felt like it had stopped holding its breath. You'd hear it again when the fog rolled in, and the shelling paused, when you and the others sat shoulder to shoulder with steaming mugs and numb hands, not talking, just listening. And the soil beneath you would make this faint groan, deep and soft and terrifying in how ordinary it became. You didn't talk about it because you weren't supposed to talk about things like that. A trench could kill you a dozen different ways. What use was there in admitting that the earth itself seemed to know your name? One night, after a bombardment that lasted almost 5 hours, you lay flat in the dugout, not moving. Your ears were still ringing. Your ribs ached from where you'd been thrown against the beam. Someone nearby was crying into their sleeve, the sound barely human, and then it happened again. That low movement beneath your spine, like the trench itself was settling, but you knew better. You pressed your hand into the mud, not for comfort, for confirmation, and there it was, a steady beat, not mechanical, not random, alive, not breathing like lungs, breathing like memory. You told yourself it was just vibration, aftershocks of distant shells maybe, or trickles of water beneath the trench floor, but deep down you understood. The ground was full, with things it had taken, with voices it hadn't finished listening to, with men who never got out. Their bodies fed the worms, their names fed the silence, their last screams and prayers seeped into the roots and rock. This land didn't forget. It didn't forgive. Every step you took was on the breath of someone who had fallen there before you. Sometimes when you sat very still, staring at the edge of the horizon that never got closer, you imagined what it must be like under there. Quiet, endless, heavy, but somehow moving, always moving. So you didn't sleep on the ground if you could help it. You used boards, crates, even discarded helmets to prop yourself up, because lying directly on the soil felt too close, like listening to a whisper meant for someone else. The ground was breathing, not just because of nature, because of memory, because of everything it had swallowed and couldn't quite digest. And every now and then, when your dreams turned feverish and your fingers curled in your sleep, you woke not to a rat or a cough or the call of your sergeant, but to the ground itself, shifting slightly beneath you, as if reminding you, you're only here for a while, and it's already begun to remember your shape. Why you whispered, even when no one was listening. At first you didn't notice it, you just talked less. Your voice got quieter, not out of fear, at least not the kind you could explain. It wasn't that shells were falling, or snipers were watching, or that the wrong sound might bring the wrong kind of attention. Though all of that was true, it was something deeper, something stranger, a silence that pressed in from the walls of the trench. Not just around you, but in you. You remember a night, you don't know which, they all blurred together, when you tried to tell a joke, one you used to tell back home. You'd said it dozens of times before, in taverns, in barracks, to make the new recruits feel a little less scared. But this time, the words barely made it out of your mouth. They felt wrong, too loud, too light. too foreign for a place where the sky never cleared and the dirt clung to your teeth. No one laughed. No one even looked. They just sat, shoulders touching, eyes down, mouths closed. And that's when you realized, nobody shouted anymore. Not unless they had to. The trench changed how people spoke. It stole the vowels and dulled the consonants. Voices thinned into whispers, not from discipline or command, but because sound itself had become dangerous, not in the way bullets were, but in the way it revealed you, made you real, made you vulnerable. You whispered, because something about the mud and the wire and the air full of metal taught you to. You whispered, even when there was no threat nearby, even when you were alone, even when the man beside you had been dead for hours, because something about that place taught you that speaking loudly was a kind of arrogance, a dare to the sky, and you didn't dare anything out here. Even the officers learned. After a while, their orders softened, yelled less, gestured more. Not just to avoid giving away your position, but because something about the loudness, any loudness, felt obscene, like scratching your name into a grave marker. You whispered into letters you never finished. You whispered prayers without believing anyone was listening. You whispered names of the ones you'd seen go under, as if giving them sound again might make them less gone. And when the shelling stopped, when the rumble finally faded and left only the faint hissing of mud shifting under moonlight, that was the loudest quiet you'd ever known. It wrapped around you, sat with you, waited, and so you whispered again, not to be heard, just to not forget what it was like to use your voice at all. There was one night, it must have been winter, though time didn't work right anymore, when you found yourself crouched in the dugout, hands wrapped around a mug of something that was more ash than coffee. A man across from you, Private Landon maybe, or someone like him, was shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that lived in his bones now. And you whispered, not anything useful, not orders, not comfort, just his name. He didn't look at you, but he stopped shaking. Sometimes that was all you had left, not courage, not orders, just a whisper in the dark, because in a place where everything echoed, screams, blasts, memory, a whisper was the only sound that belonged. And even if no one was listening, it felt like proof you were still human, still here, still alive. The smell you couldn't wash off for weeks. There were 1,000 things they warned you about before the trenches. Bullets, barbed wire, bad officers. They told you what to carry and what to leave behind. They taught you how to march, how to dig, how to fire, how to kill, but no one warned you about the smell. Not really, not in the way they should have, not in the way that mattered, because out here, the smell wasn't just something you noticed, it was something you wore. At first, it was the mud, a wet, sour odor like rotted cabbage, left in a damp root cellar. That was manageable. You told yourself it was just the earth, angry, soaked, and older than the war itself. Then came the bodies, yours and theirs, some buried, some not, some so old they'd become part of the trench wall, pressed into the dirt like a warning written in flesh. And that smell, sweet, sick, meaty, settled into your nose and never left. The uniforms didn't help. Wool held scent like it held lice. After a few weeks, your coat smelled like everything it had touched. Sweat, piss, blood, old food, and the breath of men who coughed themselves to death in the middle of the night. It clung to the fabric, thick and sour. Even when the rain came and soaked you through, the stink didn't leave. It just changed shape, dampened, deepened, spread further into the seams. You tried not to notice. After a while, you stopped flinching when your own gloves reeked of mold and rot. You got used to the way your hands smelled after handling rations, or how your boots gave off the scent of trench foot and tinned meat. You even made peace with the stink of others. But the worst part wasn't the trench, it was what came after. When they pulled you back, if you were lucky, and sent you behind the lines for rest, that's when it hit you. That's when you realized it wasn't just the trench that stank, it was you. You stripped off your coat in a billet barn miles from the front, and the other men stepped away, eyes watering. You tried to wash, but the soap couldn't compete. It foamed against your skin like it was fighting for its life, and still the smell stayed. Hot water only woke it up. It rose off your skin in thick waves, copper, mildew, fear. And then there were your hands. They told you to scrub them, soak them, scrape them with salt if you had to. But nothing could erase the smell of weeks spent handling wet canvas, old bandages, spoiled rations, and worse. The stink settled into your fingerprints, behind your nails, into the creases of your knuckles. One man, Preston, from somewhere near Leeds, tried to burn it off. Took a match to his own palm one night, after drinking too much. Said he'd rather smell burnt skin than trench death. He screamed, of course. But later, he claimed it worked. It didn't. You dreamed of it. The stink, you'd fall asleep and feel the trench again, not see it, not hear it, but smell it. And you'd wake in a panic, gasping, certain you were still down there, still surrounded by the stench of rot and wet wool and things no man should ever have to breathe. They sent you home on leave once, and your mother cried when she hugged you, not because of what you'd seen, she didn't know yet, but because of the way you smelled. She washed your clothes 3 times, boiled them, left them in the sun. But the stink had sunk into the threads, into the buttons. It didn't just cling, it owned them. You burned the uniform before you left again, and yet, when you stepped back into the trench weeks later, the smell welcomed you, like an old friend, familiar, terrible, and you whispered, without thinking, there it is. Because out here, it was never just dirt or blood or water, it was everything at once. It was fear, and metal, and mold, and filth, and it was memory. Because long after you left the front, long after the war was over, long after your medals gathered dust in some drawer, you could still wake in the middle of the night, your sheets soaked in sweat, your lungs tight, and for just one moment, you'd swear, it was still on you, still in you, that smell you couldn't wash off. The game of letters you never won. It started out simple. You were told to write home, not asked. Told 1 page a week, minimum, more, if you could manage. Keep the folks back home calm, keep the war human. Remind them that you were still someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband, not just a number tucked into a trench, thousands of miles from the life you used to have. So you wrote. At first it was easy. You tried to be honest, but not too honest. You talked about the weather, the food, the strange smell of the French countryside. You left out the part about watching a man die with your name on his lips. You said, we're keeping warm, even when you were shivering in a foot of mud. You said, we've got plenty to eat, even when dinner was a biscuit so hard it could crack a tooth. But even then you knew, this was a game. A slow, aching, ink-stained game of pretending. Pretending things were fine. Pretending they still believed you. Pretending you believed yourself. The game got harder with time, because the more you saw, the harder it became to shape the truth into sentences. Some things didn't translate. There weren't words for the sound a man makes when he realizes his leg is gone. There weren't phrases for the way blood smells when it's mixed with gas and wet soil. There was no safe way to describe what it felt like to hold a letter from home with clean handwriting and warm words while your hands were still shaking from dragging a body out of a shell hole. So your letters got shorter, or longer. Some you never finished. Some you never sent. You folded them and tucked them into your coat and told yourself you'd post them later. And when later came, you tore them up and dropped the pieces into the fire. Because how could you explain to your mother that the only reason you were still alive was because the man next to you had stood up a second too soon? Some men got good at the game. They'd write whole letters filled with nothing, talking about the way the sky looked when the clouds rolled in, how French bread wasn't as good as home, a joke someone told that morning. Entire paragraphs, beautiful and hollow, and for a moment even they believed it. For a moment their handwriting felt like a lifeline, like proof that something inside them hadn't drowned yet. But there were others, the ones who stopped writing altogether, the ones who looked at the paper, then looked away, who said, what's the point? Who folded empty envelopes and handed them in just so their names wouldn't end up on the concerningly silent list. And then there were the letters you got, from home, from people who didn't know what not to say. Letters that talked about dances you missed and cousins who got married and how the dog still waited by the door. Letters that said things like when you come home, as if that future was carved in stone, as if the war didn't turn futures into soft wet clay every single day. You memorized the handwriting, smiled at familiar phrases, tucked the paper into your breast pocket, like armor. And when someone got a letter with a black edge, everyone went quiet. That wasn't a game. That was the end of a story. Eventually the words stopped working for you. You stared at the page, tried to explain how the sky sounded like thunder even when it was clear, tried to say what it meant when someone called your name and you didn't answer because you were afraid they were already dead and your brain just hadn't caught up. But nothing came out, so you folded the paper, wrote, I'm fine, signed your name, and lost again. Because this wasn't correspondence anymore. This was survival. This was holding on by fingertips to a version of yourself that still remembered what it felt like to speak without lying. The war gave you many things, mud, hunger, fear, but it never gave you the words you really needed. That's why it was a game you never won, and why some of you kept playing it anyway, because even if it was all pretend, even if they never knew the truth, at least someone, somewhere, was still writing your name. Why silence was sometimes louder than shellfire. It's easy to imagine war as a constant roar, guns pounding, men shouting, shells whistling down from the sky like angry angels. And yes, most days it was like that. You lived in sound, explosive, unpredictable, deafening sound. The kind that rattled your ribs and made your teeth ache. The kind that didn't just fill the air, but owned it. But ask any man who lived through it, and he'll tell you the silence could be worse. Because when the guns finally stopped, when the front went still, you didn't breathe easier. You didn't unclench your jaw and smile. You listened harder. You felt your heart beat against your helmet strap. And you wondered, why is it quiet? Silence meant waiting. Silence meant something was coming. A new shelling, a gas attack, a patrol in the dark, slipping through no man's land like ghosts. Silence wasn't peace. It was the sound of a breath being held just before the scream. Sometimes it would fall over the trench like fog, a sudden, absolute quiet. No shouting, no birds, not even the wind, just the soft crackle of mud drying on your boots and the scratch of a rat chewing something you didn't want to identify. It was during those silences that you felt the war pressing in hardest, because when the shells were flying, you could at least hear the world trying to kill you. When everything stopped, you had only your thoughts. That was the danger. It was in the lull between barrages that memories came back, the ones you tried to bury under every shell crater and ration tin. You remembered your house, your mother's voice, the smell of a coat closet in winter, the exact weight of someone's hand in yours, and then you remembered where you were now, and how many men you'd seen vanish into air. Silence had edges, sharp and unexpected. It cut deeper than shrapnel, especially at night, especially when you were alone on watch, and the moon looked like a coin someone had dropped in the sky. Every sound became a question. That rustle, was it a breeze or boots? That faint clink, metal or teeth? One soldier described it once as listening for death to take a step, but it wasn't just fear. Sometimes, silence was what made the horror real. After an attack, when the ground stopped moving, and the shouting faded, there was always a moment, a stillness. That's when you heard what was left. That's when you heard men sobbing quietly, calling for their mothers, begging the sky to go back and try again, or worse, nothing at all. Just stillness, just the unbearable quiet of a place where too many hearts had stopped beating at once. Some men started talking just to fill the space, whispering nonsense, repeating their own names, making up songs about socks or beans or girls they barely remembered, not because they were cheerful, but because silence was too loud, too close, too heavy. Others went the opposite way. They stopped talking altogether, refused to answer questions, just sat in the dugout, staring at the wall, lips moving in prayer or memory or madness. Their silence was a fortress, a place to hide, a white flag to the noise inside. And then there were the letters, the ones you never received, the ones that stopped coming. The postman's silence was worse than enemy fire, because no envelope meant something had gone quiet at home, and suddenly, the silence in the trench had an echo far away, one you couldn't reach. Silence was its own kind of weapon, and it never missed. Even after the armistice, veterans carried that silence with them, into cafes, into marriage, into every too quiet room for the rest of their lives, because after the war, silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt suspicious, unsafe. You wanted the hum of a crowd, a radio, a dog barking, anything but that still, waiting, watching silence. Because once you've lived in the trenches, you learn that it's not always the shell that breaks you, sometimes it's the moment after. The night you mistook a ghost for your friend, you hadn't seen his face in 2 days, not since the last push over the top, when the sky opened like a mouth and the world fell into it. You'd been crouched behind a fallen beam, mud in your mouth, blood in your sleeve, shouting names that didn't echo back. He was one of them. You told yourself he'd made it. You told yourself he was crouched a trench or two over, sharing a can of stew with some other poor soul and cursing the taste. That he'd show up soon with a grin and a bruise and a sarcastic story about nearly losing his helmet again. That he'd toss you that look, the one that said, "Told you I'd make it." But the days passed. Then the letters. Then the silence. So when you saw him that night, just after 2 a.m., when the mist rolled low and thick, you didn't question it. He was there, standing in the trench, backlit by a flare somewhere far away, just enough to give him a glow like fog caught fire. Same uniform, same posture, same slight limp from that time he'd fallen on ice during training and swore you to secrecy. He wasn't walking, just standing, like he'd been waiting. You called his name, once, then twice. He didn't answer, but he turned, slowly, and in that moment, you believed, you needed to believe. You climbed over the crate, heart pounding, whispering curses and thank yous to whatever force had spared him. You walked toward him with your breath tight in your chest, thinking of all the things you'd say, how you thought he was dead, how much you missed him, how the trench was quieter without his humming, how the jokes weren't funny anymore. But when you got closer, the air got cold, unnaturally cold, and then he was gone. No sound, no step, just not there. Like the mist had folded around him and taken him back. You stopped, frozen, listening for boots, breath, a laugh, anything. But the trench was empty, and now, standing where he stood, you noticed something else. The mud was undisturbed, no footprints, no tracks, just smooth, untouched ground. That's when the chill crept in, not the kind that bites your fingers, but the kind that wraps around your heart and squeezes. He hadn't made it, not really, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the first time he'd stood there. You never told the others. What would you say? That you'd seen a ghost, that he'd come back, just for a moment, to make sure you were still alive. Some men said the trenches played tricks on your mind, that the gas, the hunger, the trauma, all of it could make you see things that weren't there. Faces from home, shadows wearing the memories of men you'd buried. But you knew what you saw, and you knew it wasn't madness. It was grief wearing boots, it was memory made visible. A soul, maybe, still caught between yesterday and the next morning. And so after that night, whenever the fog rolled in thick and still, you didn't look too hard down the line, you didn't follow footsteps that shouldn't be there, and if you saw a figure in the mist, familiar waiting, you turned away, not out of fear, out of love, because sometimes in a place where everything was being taken, a ghost was just someone who wasn't ready to let go of you either, and that, somehow, made it harder to leave the war behind. How long you could go without saying a name. There was a time, maybe back at training camp or even earlier, when saying someone's name was second nature. It meant familiarity, friendship, presence. You'd yell it over the din of marching boots, shout it across mess line arguments, write it in letters, even chant it drunkenly when someone made a fool of themselves during leave. Names were how you held on to people. Names meant they were real, but in the trenches, names got heavy, too heavy, because every name you said out loud risked being the last time you'd ever say it. And the moment you said it, you gave it weight, you gave that person shape, and when they disappeared, that shape hollowed out into something unbearable, so you stopped. At first, you told yourself it was for practical reasons. Too loud, too risky. Don't want to draw attention, don't want the enemy to hear. That's what you told yourself when you called your best friend mate, or you, or oi. But deep down you knew, you weren't avoiding noise. You were avoiding grief, because the moment you spoke a name, you formed a thread between yourself and that person. And in this war, threads snapped fast. One wrong step, one unlucky moment, one shell, and the name you spoke yesterday became a ghost you had to carry. So instead, you went quiet. Not all at once. At first, it was just a few, a name you'd said every day for months, suddenly avoided, not because you loved them less, but because you couldn't handle what came next. You'd look at them, nod, maybe even smile, but the syllables never crossed your lips. Then more names followed. Even when writing letters, you'd leave names out, referring to people only as he or the fellow from Derby or my bunkmate. Your family wouldn't know who you meant, but it was safer that way. If he died before you posted the letter, the ink wouldn't betray your heart. The silence grew. You started speaking in half sentences and nicknames, calling people Sarge, Kid, Old Man, anything but their real names. Names were too sharp, too final. You'd seen men scream names into the dark, begging for a response that never came. You'd heard names sobbed into sleeves, etched into mud with trembling fingers, whispered over bodies cooling too fast to be saved. You didn't want to be one of them, so you stopped saying them, and the less you said, the more you carried. The trench became a place of nameless men doing named things, lighting cigarettes, cleaning rifles, telling jokes with hollow laughter. You'd recognize their coughs, the way they tied their boots, the rhythm of their breath when they slept. But never again did you speak what they'd been called back home. And when they were gone, when the spot beside you went cold and still, you couldn't even cry out for them properly. Because you hadn't let yourself say their name. You might whisper it once, just once, when no one was around. When the smoke was thick, and the rats were quiet, and the world was pretending to rest. You might murmur it like a prayer, like a secret spell, like a guilty apology you didn't know how to say any other way. And then it would be gone again. Back into silence, because the truth is, the longer you survived, the more names you buried inside yourself. Not under crosses, not under dirt, but inside your lungs, your bones, your breath. You'd hear the sound of someone laughing in a way that reminded you of a boy from your village, whose name you once said every day for years, and you'd flinch. Not because you forgot, but because you remembered. And that's what scared you. Because war takes names and turns them into weights, and if you say too many, if you carry too many, eventually, you stop being able to move forward. So instead, you just didn't say them at all. And in the end, your silence was not a forgetting. It was a kind of mourning, a quiet tribute, a memory carried not in voice, but in survival. Because sometimes the only way to keep going was to hold their name behind your teeth and never let it out again. The sound of a watch in a pocket that had no owner. You didn't find the body, not all of it, anyway. But the coat was still there, half buried in the churned up mud by the dugout wall, sleeves stiff, collar torn, soaked so deeply with water and time that the fabric had forgotten it. Once belonged to someone alive. It was brown, or had been once. Now, it was the same sallow grey as everything else in the trench. You crouched down because something had caught your ear. Not a shout, not the distant echo of shelling, but a sound that shouldn't have been there. A ticking, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. At first, you thought you were imagining it, that it was something inside your own skull, a leftover pulse from too many sleepless nights, and not enough silence. But then you realized it wasn't in your head. It was in the coat. You reached in slowly, like it might bite. There, nestled in the inner pocket, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been white, but was now closer to earth than linen, was a pocket watch, still ticking, still alive. In a world that had buried everything else, this one small machine had refused to stop. It hadn't belonged to you. It probably never would. But for a moment, holding it in your hand, you were filled with something unfamiliar in the trenches. Continuity. The idea that time hadn't stopped just because everything else had. That even when breath was gone, and names were forgotten, and mud had claimed the face of the man who once wore this coat, something kept going. The watch was heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. It wasn't gold or polished. It had no initials etched on the back, just simple, worn steel, and a steady tick that reminded you that time was moving forward, whether you were ready or not. You didn't know who it belonged to. You could guess. There had been a man in that spot, just 2 nights ago, smoking too much and laughing too loud. He was always checking the time, even though no one really needed to. "Can't be late to dinner," he'd say, with a wink. You'd all pretend not to notice. There hadn't been a proper meal in weeks. You turned the watch over. There was a crack across the face, hairline, but unmistakable, like something had hit it hard. Maybe it had fallen. Maybe it had been dropped when the man who carried it was pulled away by something stronger than time. Still, it ticked. In the chaos of the trenches, where so many things ended without ceremony, this watch had continued its tiny private ritual, 1 second, then another, like a heartbeat that refused to join the silence. You didn't take it for yourself, not exactly, but you couldn't leave it there. You didn't want it buried, so you kept it in your own pocket, not as a trophy, not even really as a keepsake, just as a reminder that someone had been here, someone with a schedule, a life, a pocket, a habit of winding the thing every night before sleep, as if sleep was guaranteed. Sometimes, in the darker hours, you'd hold it close to your ear, let it become your lullaby, not of peace, but of defiance, a sound that didn't belong in a place like this, and yet stayed anyway. The men around you began to notice. They didn't ask, but now and then, someone would glance at your coat pocket when the world went quiet enough to hear the ticking. Their eyes would soften. A few would close their own for a moment, as if trying to imagine what it would be like to still believe in the future, to believe that somewhere, beyond the wire, time still ticked for reasons other than waiting for the next shell. One night, weeks later, a shell fell close, too close. You hit the ground hard. When you stood back up, your head ringing, and your boots filled with something thicker than water, you checked your arms, your chest, your side. You didn't reach for your rifle. You reached for the pocket, and when your fingers closed around the cold curve of the watch's case and felt it still ticking, you nearly wept. Not for yourself, but for the man who'd once needed that ticking to get through a day, and for the fact that now, somehow, you needed it too. The day you forgot what you were fighting for. It didn't happen all at once. That kind of forgetting comes quietly, like water finding the cracks in a wall. One day, you're writing a letter home, telling them about the cold, the rations, the rats, still trying to be funny, still trying to sound like you, and you sign it. We're doing our part. We believe in what we're here for. But days passed, then weeks, then months, and belief started slipping. At first, you thought it was just exhaustion. You were tired, after all. Everyone was tired in the bones, in the eyes, in the way you started to see things and no longer reacted. But somewhere beneath that exhaustion, something else had shifted. The question had crept in, why are we still here? The posters had told you things, so had the officers, so had the newspapers back home. Words like honor, duty, country, justice, defense, they sounded strong once like anchors holding you in place. But the war didn't look like the posters. It looked like mud and broken teeth. It smelled like rot and bleach and old smoke. It sounded like someone crying 3 dugouts over, quietly into their sleeve, hoping no one heard, no one judged. It felt like trying to remember what day it was and realizing it didn't matter. There were no Tuesdays in the trench, only hours between bombardments, and one day, maybe while you were eating something unidentifiable from a dented tin, maybe while wrapping another bandage around your foot, you realized you hadn't thought about the reason. Not in days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. You hadn't said the word home out loud in months. The letters slowed down. You stopped mentioning what you were fighting for, because no one asked anymore. Even the officers didn't say it. They just gave orders, told you where to go, what not to do, and when to dig. They looked just as hollow, just as tired, just as far away. What were you fighting for? Not for the man you watched die with a photograph of his baby clenched in his hand. Not for the farm boy who asked for his mother between coughs of blood. Not for the others who disappeared into the wire, the smoke, the black space between explosions where names didn't matter anymore. So what was left? You fought for the man next to you. That was true. For the chance that if you got lucky you might drag him out of a collapse before the next shell dropped. You fought for the moment where you could get 5 minutes of silence without your hands shaking. You fought for the familiar knock on the dugout wall that meant the runner had made it back alive. You fought for tomorrow, just tomorrow, not for flags, not for kings, not even for medals, just to wake up with your fingers still attached, your lungs still working, and some coffee, no matter how burnt, left to drink. Maybe that's all anyone was really fighting for by the end, and maybe that was enough. But deep down some small part of you kept the question, buried like an unexploded shell, waiting, because you knew that when the war ended, if it ended, you'd have to dig that question back up. You'd have to face it, you'd have to look in the mirror and ask was it worth it, and you weren't sure you'd like the answer,